At the end of the last video, I made the first alpha playtest version of our Advanced Shmup. One of my playtesters was Sebastian, the person behind the music in the game. And what Sebastian said was, hey, this game looks pretty finished. Let's release it like this. Look at me. Look at the length of this video. Now look back at me. We were a ways away from being finished, and this is how we got there. Hi everybody, one last time. I am Christian, welcome to the Advanced Shmup tutorial, and this is going to be the story of how we turned the alpha version of our game into a finished game. We're going to look into that, but we're also going to look at the feedback and we're going to discuss the future. But first of all, yes, the game is out. It's out right now, you can play it right away. It's on itch.io, it's also on the Lex Level forums, which means it's also out on Splore. Please enjoy and spread the word. Now let's jump in. How did we get here? So after the last video, I sent out the alpha playtest version to selected playtesters and to my coffee supporters. The goal here was to find the most serious issues before, testing the game with a wider audience. And what I'm doing here is actually following an advice or recipe from an older book that I really like from Steve Krug called Don't Make Me Think. It's a book about web design from a time when websites looked like this, but the practical advice it offers is still valid and universally applicable. Any round of testing is most likely to reveal only the most obvious issues, so it's better to make multiple smaller rounds of tests rather than one big playtest. That way you can catch also the small issues. And I got some really good feedback. Octane once again recorded a small video from his first test. I then compiled and organized all of the feedback into the master plan. Most of the feedback could be categorized in 3 categories. First of all, there were issues with visibility. The hyper mode needed some tweaks and fixes. The boss fight needed some rework. And of course, there were like small bugs that I need to attend to. And there was like some things that I wanted to do myself. So actually there were like 5 categories of issues that we had to deal with. Let's start with the visibility. Some people reported having issues seeing the bullets. I took this feedback very, very seriously because this was something that's very important to me. With some helpful nudging from the Discord chat, I decided to give in and finally use the alternate color palette after all. This is something I decided at the very start of the project. I didn't want to use the alt color palette in order to keep the project simple, but the project has grown to be quite complicated anyway, and this late there's basically no harm anymore. So I decided to improve bullet visibility by making the background less noisy. Especially the forest tiles had a lot of dithering and harsh contrasts, which made it difficult to read the screen. I did a few prototypes to try out some color replacements and came up with this solution. I decided to add a dark green from the alt color palette to reduce the contrast in the forest background. But of course it's Pico-8, so in order to squeeze in that additional color, I had to get rid of another one. And after some soul searching, it occurred to me that the one color I am using the least is actually black. I had to do some tiny changes to the background tiles, but otherwise we were good to go. By using the new dark green instead of the dark blue on the trees, the background was visually a lot less noisy and it made the bullets stand out more. But this was not enough. I really wanted those bullets to pop. So I did some experiments in Sprite using Louis Chapman's excellent work for Calican as a starting point. I quickly realized that I would need to add a pink outline to the basic bullets. I also replaced the tiny bullets that everybody hated with a different and more spinny design. That one also got a pink outline, and with those 2 designs in place, the big cloud-looking bullets look a little bit strange, as if they didn't really belong, so I decided to replace them with a more traditional design. Okay, so much on the bullet visibility. Now moving on to some of the hyper mode issues. First of all, everybody hated the screen clearing bomb.
What? I don't think that screen clearing bomb is doing anything for me, Chief.
Even I hated it. So I made it so that double tapping the hyper button would trigger the normal bomb. This had the advantage that I was able to remove the iris effect entirely, saving some tokens. Next, I decided to add the so-called coyote time to basically everywhere. Coyote time is a term borrowed from platformer design. It's when, after stepping off a ledge, you're often given a grace period during which you can still press the jump button, even though you are technically no longer on a platform. This eliminates frustrations of having to hit a jump at frame perfect precision. I added similar grace periods to the hyper button presses. So when you run out of charge or you get hit in hyper mode, you lose hyper mode, but you can still, a couple of frames afterwards, you can still press the hyper mode button to still trigger the bomb. This also applies to normal mode. When you get hit, but you have to charge to trigger a bomb, you can then, as you are dying, still press the bomb button to trigger the bomb and to prevent the loss of life. I just recently learned that there's a term for that. That one is called death bombing. Implementing 2 of those cases was pretty simple. Getting hit activates the die function, which starts a hit stop for 30 frames. I just added a check for button presses during that hit stop. You could essentially cancel out of the hit stop. The only difficulty here was managing all the variables associated with hyperbomb and scoring and charge. Like, the bomb expects the hyper mode to have been active, so bombing straight from normal mode requires some hyper mode variables to be set and so forth. It's a little bit of a kerfuffle. The coyote time on losing hyper by running out of charge was a bit more tricky because there's no hit stop associated with that. I had to add a new timer variable for that, and I set it to 30 frames as well in order to keep it all consistent. And yeah, these are super generous grace periods, but they were the most convenient to implement right now, and if there is any issue with that, we would find out later in testing. That is why we are doing multiple rounds of testing. And while I was messing around with the die function, this was also a good opportunity to fix the one straight up bug that we found. Some people reported that sometimes the life counter would drop to -1, and I traced it back to the update function. You see, if you get hit, the game would start the hit stop with the die function, but the update function would then continue checking for more collision on that frame. So sometimes you would get hit twice on one frame, losing 2 lives. The solution was to add a return after triggering the die function. I added a similar return to the hyper and bomb triggers, so there is no collision check on the frame that you activate hyper. I moved the enemy and the bullet update a bit higher up in the update function, so all of that would still happen. And then I made some more tweaks to the hyper mode, like for example, some people weren't exactly aware that getting hit in hyper mode wouldn't cost you a life. And I realized that was because the ship was still exploding when that happened. So I made sure that this wasn't happening. New players also were struggling to understand the system that you have to bomb out of the hyper mode. I already had a ready indicator next to the gauge when hyper was ready, but it didn't say anything about bombing. I changed it to a button prompt. Now it would say hyper when you had enough charge and bomb in hyper mode. Not a complete fix, but it helps. I also decided to reset the movement speed to normal during hyper. I found that you often wanted to use hyper against big enemies where you would be dodging a lot of bullets, and if you were moving faster in hyper mode, that made it actually harder to dodge those bullets. But then I also turned off the collision detection with enemies in hyper, so enemies no longer hurt you when you're in hyper mode. And that is because I wanted people to be aggressive in hyper mode, and I think this is a good way to promote that. And finally, I made the iframes more generous. I increased the amount of iframes. I even added iframes to like running out of charge, losing hyper when running out of charge. Just a generous splash of iframes everywhere. Now, we haven't addressed all of the feedback just yet, but at this point I want to talk about something that I wanted to implement. Because this was actually a big challenge and it did cost me some sleepless nights. How do I add a logo on the start screen? It is always very impressive when a Pico-8 game manages to pull off a pretty start screen because it can be hard to do. Pretty much all of our sprite sheet space is all used up and we are running out of tokens. How do we put big letters on the screen at no cost? My initial thought was to use the custom text font and just blow the letters up by using print control codes. They would get all blocky and ugly, but then I could maybe use some outlines and then some manual fixes to smooth out the letters. I spent some time in Sprite and came up with this monstrosity. Now, does this look great? Absolutely no. But does it save us a bunch of tokens? Also no. Back to the drawing board. I decided to tackle the problem from the opposite direction. What kind of text would even look great? What is the best case scenario? And then if I figure this out, then maybe I can reverse engineer how to make that happen. I tried a bunch of cheesy cartoony fonts and settled on this one. This font is called Supersonic Rocket Ship. And something that struck me when seeing this is how the identity of the game suddenly fell into place. It's giving comic book cover, it's giving B-movie title vibes, it's perfect. I added an outline and a thick drop shadow and another outline around all of that, and that made-up title, that made-up game that we had suddenly became real. It is pretty magical. So now the question was, how do I get that into our code? The outlines don't seem that hard to make. We are actually already doing this with our text, so maybe you can reuse some of our functions. So if we strip out the outlines, or we are left with is just like a 1-bit image, just black and white pixels. So I thought maybe I can compress this image. There are quite a few compression algorithms in the Lexalophon forums, but they usually expect 16 color images, and they aren't very token efficient. So I decided I will write my own algorithm. I would just loop through all of the pixels and encode them into a sequence of numbers, with each bit corresponding to one pixel, black or white for 0 and 1.
Okay, just because I know that somebody will complain about this. Yes, I know, this is not technically a compression algorithm, this is just encoding, right? The compression comes from the fact that we are expecting the image to be 1 bit, which usually graphics in Pico-8 are not.
And full disclosure, to speed things up, I made ChatGPT whip up something for me. I'm super slow when it comes to bitwise operations, and I just wanted to see if this is even viable. Now, we're gonna discuss AI later in this video, but needless to say, the code it generated already needed some fixing. I got it to run, it did encode the image, and I got it into the game. But even though the code was pretty lean on tokens compared to the other compression algorithms, it still burned quite a hole in my budget. And this got me thinking, what we're doing here is actually something that Pico-8 is already doing in the background. When we import a custom font, that's actually what Pico-8 does. The 1-bit sprites of each character are encoded into a sequence of numbers. So why not just reuse this built-in functionality? I went back to the custom font snippet and basically removed all of the characters I wouldn't need. I just left the numbers, the uppercase letters, and a few special characters. Then I split my logo into smaller sprites and copy-pasted it into the unused characters in the font. Now I had to tweak the font width on the new characters, but once I was done, I realized I could just draw the entire logo using a single print command. And that is actually a super useful coincidence, because that means I could just use the already existing text outline functions to add the outlines and the drop shadow. Well, almost. You see, there's a lot of outlines we're drawing here, right? And it's also a really big logo, and every time we draw one outline, that means we're drawing 5 copies of that huge logo. And this is a design where outlines are having outlines. So when I put that into the draw function at the start screen actually started to drop frames. So what we actually need to do is to pre-draw the logo. So on init, I set the screen memory address to the extended memory, to this extra memory space. And I draw the logo with all of the outlines once into that extended memory. And then later in the draw function, I can temporarily set the sprite sheet into the extended memory and just draw the finished logo with all of the outlines and everything to the screen like if it was a sprite. Now that was quite a roller coaster ride, but I finally got what I wanted. I was drawing a pretty logo to the screen, and the token cost turned out to be modest. I was particularly proud of this snippet of code where I combined 2 poke statements to turn on the custom font and set the screen to the extended memory into one single poke4 command, because those addresses actually are nearby. Neat. Moving on to a different issue that I want to fix that was always bugging me on the previous prototypes. On some of the previous versions of the game, I noticed that sometimes ground enemies wouldn't scroll in sync with the background. There would be some cobblestoning happening there. And I knew what the problem was. It was another one of those pesky subpixel problems. The background just moves 0.2 pixels per frame, and sometimes that can be enough to make the enemy snap to the next pixel before the background does. In the past, I already tried to fix it many times by flooring the Y position of the enemies to remove the subpixels, but it never quite worked out. So this late in the development, I made the quite risky decision to just completely change how scrolling works. Well, I'm exaggerating, not completely, but instead of scrolling by 0.2 pixels every frame, I would instead scroll by an entire pixel, but only every 5 frames. This would be the same scrolling speed overall, but now I could move the ground enemies perfectly in sync with the background. And yeah, that was just a solution. No notes, that's just the way to go. Moving on. Okay, so another one of those sleepless nights kind of issues was the explosion size. So far, we only had one explosion size, and for some enemies, that looked really goofy. Because for the big enemies, the explosions would be smaller than the thing that is exploding, and in my book, that's a big no-no. But also we had a few situations where the game was stuttering, and this tended to happen when a lot of small enemies were exploding. So I thought I also needed a small economical explosion. Now, explosions are quite complicated code that we started writing way back in episode 10. so I was quite nervous touching any of that. I whipped up a small prototyping cart with 3 enemies and started experimenting. The key to making the explosion bigger turned out to be a single scale parameter to our grape function. If the scale was set to 1, the explosion would be the same, but if it was set to any other value, it would scale all of the blobs and the distances between the blobs by that amount. So in the end, it wasn't really that hard. The small explosion was pretty straightforward too. The normal explosion is 3 clusters of blobs after each other to simulate that realistic billowing of a fireball. For the small explosion, I just turned it into a single cluster that cycles through all of the colors. I also shortened the overall time of the small explosion. In order to apply the different explosion styles to different enemies, I used the FX column in the enemy editor that we haven't really used for anything until now. I knew it would come in handy. Alright, let's move on to the boss, because this was probably the biggest learning experience. So people didn't really like the boss. The first attack was great, but on all of the other attacks you were more busy avoiding the boss than to actually shoot it. This didn't feel satisfying. This is a shooting game. People want to shoot the boss. I was also leaning a little bit too much into avoiding the actual boss sprite and had too little interesting bullet patterns to dodge. Lesson learned. So I redid the entire fight. I kept just the first pattern and added a whole bunch of new ones. So the first new pattern was just this dense bullet hell style spiral, inspired by some of the references that Octane sent me. The idea here was to create these lanes that players have to stay in. In order to make the lanes tight enough, I had to push Pico-8 to the limit. If you pause, you can see some of the tricks. For example, I'm not actually shooting the bullets all around the boss, just in one direction to save some processing power. The second new pattern is not really a new pattern, it's actually a leftover attack from the old boss design. The boss swoops to the bottom, but instead of going back and forth like in the previous design, I'm just doing it once. Really, one of the most important reasons why this attack is in here is in order to get the boss from one side of the screen to the other, because the other side of the screen is where the next attack starts. Now, the third new design was an attempt to capture the spirit of that first pattern. I have the boss shoot these wide spreads from both sides. Those are actually aimed, so the player needs to stay mobile. But unlike the first pattern, the shots have gaps in between them that the ships can easily fly into. But it's also possible to fly around if you're really, really fast. So basically you need to decide whether you want to micro dodge or macro dodge. Now, for this specific attack, I rewrote the firing position one last time. Previously, I had this sphere to mirror flag that would duplicate and mirror every shot from the second firing position to the other side of the enemy. I removed that and replaced it with just straight commands. So now we have 4 firing commands. FR1 and FR2 just fire straight from the 2 firing positions like before. FR3 is the second firing position but mirrored to the other side. And FR4 is duplicate and mirror, so 2 and 3 together. That way, when I have a symmetrical firing position, 2 guns on both sides, I can also choose to fire just from one of those 2 guns. That is more flexible and is also kind of easier to use. So I made those functions for the third pattern, but I also use it for the fourth new pattern as well. This one is just firing simple circles of bullets, but alternating between left and right firing position. These are just simple unaimed shots that would usually have safe spots. But because the boss is moving slowly, any potential safe spot is moving too. And then we cycle back to the beginning. So overall, this boss fight is more bullet heavy and arguably harder, but it also goes faster because you can shoot at the boss much easier. And I have to say, at this point in time, the design felt a little bit chaotic and unfocused. It felt as if I was throwing just stuff at the wall to see what sticks. I assumed we would figure out, what works and what doesn't work in the playtesting. Now, to wrap up the boss, I also added a health bar. It's not a great health bar because, all of the UI is in the way and it's just very difficult to squeeze anything in there. This is really the best I could come up with under those circumstances. Now, moving on to another feature that I always wanted to add. I always wanted to add something to help newcomers make progress in the game. Yeah, remember all the way back on episode 2? One of our mission goals was to create some kind of onboarding system. I had tons of ideas on how to make shmups newcomer friendly, but the problem with Pico-8 is that there is just so much you can do within the limitations. And yes, I knew that even going in. And the Pico-8 limitations will probably force our hand, will make the decisions for us. So I didn't have high hopes. But now was the time to try something, and I wanted to get at least one idea in. So throughout development, I kept thinking about why people drop out of trying to beat arcade games. After all, the structure of those games is quite similar to, roguelites like Hades or Dead Cells. And with those games, people are happy to try over and over again. So why do those roguelites succeed where arcade games fail? One possible answer is that roguelites have these progression systems where each run can potentially unlock something. And yeah, I think this is somewhat true, but I also think we need to dig a little bit deeper. So I believe that progression systems are so successful at motivating players because they give players the reason to believe that the next run will be different. And the strange thing is that this is not really about something that changes about the game. This is something about what is happening inside the player's head. Because if you're a pro shmup player, you don't need the systems. You already believe that next run is going to be different. You have this confidence in your skill, and you already know that if you just keep trying, your experience will carry you further and further in the game. New players lack that confidence, and so I thought maybe we could address that. Maybe we just needed to give them a little bit of a push. I wanted players to notice that they're actually making progress, and I want to give them a small tangible reward for keeping trying. Somewhat inspired by the Bloodstain system from the Dark Souls series, the player's ship would now drop a flight recorder pickup on game over. On subsequent runs, if the player made it up all the way where they died previously, they could pick up the flight recorder for a 1-up. What the system does is basically saying that if you can make it as far as you did last time around, you are basically guaranteed making more progress because you get more resources. So every attempt has the potential to carry you further into the game. There's a real tangible possibility that the next run will be different. Now, the actual implementation wasn't pretty, I'm afraid. We used up all the pretty at this point. I had to hack in a third pickup type that would behave differently, so it would scroll with the background and not react to getting sucked in. For the dropping animation, I'm using the particle system. I hacked in a new property that would make the particle bounce by inverting the vertical speed once it drops below a certain position on the screen. I also had to add a new pop-up sprite and a new sound effect to communicate the 1-up. All a bit messy, but not especially token heavy. And that's great because we still had enough tokens for one last feature. Clouds. I really wanted to have clouds. It's something I had in a very early prototype all the way back before this series began. I thought it was a great opening. It always reminded me of that old unfinished Pico-8 shmup Burning Rose. It also reminded me of the Radical Rim 9000. I had the tokens, so I went for it. I just copied over my old code, but slimmed it way down. Essentially, the clouds are just blobs of 3 circles each. We are drawing 3 circles to get those thick outlines. When the clouds overlap, the gray outline will be cut off, so it looks a little bit like soft shading. And then I have 3 layers of blobs, each in its own table. I move every layer at a different speed to get that parallax effect. When a blob reaches the bottom, it is just moved to the top like the stars in the basic shmup tutorial. And when the clouds are supposed to thin out, I just make the blobs smaller when they respawn, and later I stop respawning them altogether. Simple as that. I was over the moon to be able to get that system in. Alright, now just a couple of fixes and we're done. So I redid the score display after Hyper. I always wanted to see how much points I got out of the last Hyper, and that number was very small, so I made it bigger so it's easier to see. I also added the ability to add flashing text in the middle of the screen. It was easy to lose track of your life count in the heat of the battle, so now there would be a flashing last life when you were down to your last life. For the flashing text, I decided to finally add a function to center text. This was something I've been putting off for a while. Now this is tricky because with our custom font, the different characters have different widths, so it's difficult to figure out how long a piece of text is, and you have to figure out how long it is if you want to center it. I did some experiments and finally came up with this weird solution. I use split to break the text up into individual characters and put them in a table. And then I use the count function to count how many narrower characters there are in an array. This is literally the first time I use the count function. This project is getting weird. We need to finish it. I'm worried. I wrapped up all of the functionality in a single function called GOTPrint, dot print, which means justified and outline print. With this function, I could center any text, but I could also make it write justified by changing just a single parameter. This actually simplified all of the weird hacks and workarounds I used previously in the UI and probably ended up actually saving us some tokens in the end. Nice. And while we're here, remember that add space function that adds spaces to long numbers to make them more readable? I noticed that every time we used it, we always used it exclusively on a number that was a, signed 32-bit integer that needed to be converted into a string first. The weird trick that we use to save long numbers in a single variable. I realized I could merge those two steps into one function to save a whole bunch of tokens. But in order to do that, I had to rewrite add space to no longer be recursive, because that wouldn't work if you had a step at the very beginning. So yeah, that's no longer recursive. Sometimes fancy code gets in the way. With the flashing text working, I also overhauled the checkpoint system. After much deliberation, I decided to only have 3 checkpoints. One for the boss practice and one after each of the big enemy encounters. I also made it so that checkpoints are unlocked as you play through the game. I used the flashing text to call out whenever you unlock a new checkpoint. And of course, the checkpoint unlocks, as well as the location of the flight recorder, had to be stored in persistent data. And finally, we get to the last-minute level tweaks. I thinned out the long rows of tanks to improve performance. I made the small tanks and snakes shoot 2 bullets instead of 3 for the same reasons. While doing so, I also noticed that one of the snakes was actually 2 snakes spawning right on top of each other. Whoops! I also tweaked the donut attack patterns. The shots now use the new bullet designs. They also start wider apart but are angled closer together. This makes it a little bit less awkward to stay in the lane. And I also added more obvious gaps in the stream in case you are brave enough to weave between them. As anticipated, people weren't excited about the snake's enemies coming from the back. Luckily, this was an easy fix. I just made an indestructible static enemy that looks like a warning cross symbol and used the schedule editor to spawn it just before the flying enemies come in. And finally, as a little treat, I added a menu command to highlight the actual hitbox. And with that, beta version 1 was finished. The playtest for Beta 1 was more public. I created an open thread in the Discord servers. Despite more people playing, there were far fewer reported issues. That was the plan all along. That's why we did multiple tests, so we can also find the small things. Over the next few days, I released a few new beta versions with just small fixes. So for example, there was a bug with the coyote time not quite working. We also realized the bullet cancelling stopped working quite a while ago. Players wanted to save their hitbox settings. And one tester even noticed that the shots weren't quite symmetrical. So overall small things, but I was glad to have the extra sets of eyes help me tracking it all down. Possibly the biggest discussion ensued with the novel flight recorder features. I had set it up so that the flight recorder only drops at the point where players made the furthest progress so far. When players beat the game, the recorder would stop appearing. This also meant that good players would basically never see the recorder because they beat the game so quickly, which was a little bit disappointing. This would also mean that those players would be given less lives. There would be potentially incentives to reset your save file to get that extra life from the flight recorder. We went back and forth on this a lot, but eventually I decided to spawn the flight recorder in front of the boss when you beat the game. But the feedback I was really waiting for was criticism of the new boss patterns. Surprisingly, it turns out the boss was fine. Yes, the ship was moving a little bit too fast for some of the tight patterns, but overall people liked the boss. I noticed that it was a little bit too easy to just bomb spam through most of those dance patterns, so I added a little nerf. During the boss fight, the star pickups would give a lot less charge, so you could drop a bomb or two on the tricky patterns, but you had to recharge a hypermeter the hard way. You had to make them count. One of the final fixes of the boss fight was tweaking the scoring. There were basically 2 ways to get points during the boss fight. One was by shooting the boss while in hyper mode, which gave you a little bit of star value on every hit. You had to dodge the bullets for a while in hyper mode and then score out with a bomb. The other way to score was to kill the boss with a bomb, which would add the score of the boss kill to the star value for a potential last big score. I watched a few really successful attempts and decided that the latter was a little bit too valuable, so I shifted the balance towards the former to reward dodging the patterns more. Another small fix included reducing the dead zone by half. Popcorn enemies were a bit too bulky when you tried to point blank them at the top of the screen. And I also added a few inert tanks before the donut enemies because I noticed that players were killing the pill formation super quickly and would have no enemies on the screen for a good while. Finally, players were asking for better feedback when hyper was running out, so I added a beeping sound. Now, adding sounds at this point was actually super hard because we are running out of sound effects. I had to actually put multiple sound effects in one SFX slot and use the starting note parameters to play just a part of the entire effect. But as long as they were only simple beeps, that was good enough. So after a couple of iterations, the third beta version looked as if we were ready for release, so it was time for one last surprise. You see, Pico-8 cards always have like this little illustration, like the card label image, right? And in addition, I knew that whenever you upload the game to some platform like itch.io or something, you always need to provide a thumbnail. So, as an extra cherry on top, I decided to commission an artist for the cover illustration. I was on a Pokemon binge recently and I saw some really nice cartoony YouTube thumbnails by the artist Mag Draws. I thought they would be ideal for what I had in mind, so I contacted them earlier this year, and to my delight, they said yes. I sent them a summary of what the game was all about, along with all of my pixel art, and asked them to create a cover image in the spirit of the Super Mario Land cover by Yuichi Kotabe. I wanted something light-hearted and dynamic. I also wanted the hero jet to be super chibi, like the original Lego set it was based on. Working with Mag was extremely pleasant. They sent me an early sketch and were super patient with all of the requests and annoying little nitpicks that I had. I'd been a bit of a pain in the butt because I wanted the jet to be just right, but it was worth it because they nailed it. I then converted that illustration into pixel art by redrawing it by hand, and it came out exactly how I hoped it would. Thank you so much, Mag. It was a pleasure working with you. Now let's get serious a little bit. I know some of you are maybe wondering if maybe using AI for something like this would have been a good idea. We don't really have the space for a proper AI talk, but let me get something off the chest at this point. Do not use AI to promote your game. I think it is a terrible idea. Even if you like the kind of illustration AI creates, putting it on the cover of your game makes the game look like a scam. I know that many of you out there feel you have to use AI because you think you don't have the skills or you don't have the budget to commission an artist like I did here. In which case, this is my advice. Do the thing that all of the generations of indie developers did before there was AI. Find a way. Reach out to people to collaborate with, or maybe develop a visual style that you can actually pull off. The whole point of being an independent developer, the whole point of working with something like Pico-8 is to learn to work with the resources that you have, because that's how you get creative solutions. You know, all the way back in history when we discovered radioactivity, people didn't really know what it was good for or if it was good or bad, right? So at the beginning, they just put it everywhere because that was the hype. They even made radioactive toothpaste. I think that's exactly where we are with AI right now. So what I'm saying is, be smart. Don't eat the radioactive toothpaste. I don't know, do we need an AI video? Let me know if I should make an AI video. Anyway, moving on, the finishing touches were adding the credits in the menu and a logo on the splash screen. For the logo, I used the same trick as before. I squeezed it all into the custom font. And so with the release candidate finished, I was ready to move on to making the website. For Cherry Bomb, I made an itch page that looked like an old school arcade cabinet. I did a similar thing for Cat Crisis Now. This time around my cabinet was based on a Japanese style arcade machine. I just found this photo on Reddit, and after a day of Photoshop, I came up with this. I'm especially happy that I was able to squeeze in most of the important instructions on the shelf where the stick is and the buttons. And so with that, almost exactly 2 years after we started this project, the game was finally released. What a crazy journey this was. Did we achieve our goals? Did we make an awesome shmup? Well, if you go all the way back to the beginning, the goal was to make a one-evening game, something that occupies people for one evening. And looking at the overwhelming feedback I received, I would say that, yeah, we did pretty good. That's the highest praise that you can get from a German. Not bad. No, but seriously, something that has been a bit of a struggle from the very beginning is to bridge this divide between, beginners and pro players. Because especially with shmups, this divide can be so wide and it's like impossible to hit a sweet spot in there. We've been discussing this at great lengths in the very beginning in the second episode. And there's one thing that happened where, the game really exceeded my expectations, my wildest dreams. You see, initially the plan was to release the game right now when this video gets released. But a special event forced my hand. The shmup community over at the Shmup Junkie Discord was about to start a 2-week shmup caravan scoring competition, and Kettle Crisis would be a good game to play in this time. And so I released the game before this video came out, so all of the shmup sickos could play the game competitively. And oh boy, did they play the heck out of this game. Going in, I was never confident that I would be able to pull off a satisfying scoring system. Even in the recent months, the feedback was always a little bit mixed. The system was a little bit unusual and convoluted, and some testers expressed concerns.
You have to kill enemies in hyper to increase the thing, which... I mean, alright, let's try that.
I had very little hope that the game would stand up to that kind of scrutiny by some of the best shmup players. So imagine my surprise when somehow the game held up. Already in the beta, we saw that with the right strategies, you could get some crazy high scores. We celebrated players hitting 1 million, then 2 million, then Indra S managed to pull off an eye-watering 3 million high score. But throughout the scoring competition, the new players quickly caught up and kept pushing the limit higher and higher. Soon we breached 4 million and then even 5 million.
And yeah, I recorded the audio a while ago, but the high score at the end of this competition was 6 million by Indra S. I will post a link to the high score list down in the doobly-doo. Thank you everybody for participating. I was blown away. Oh, and shout out to the Cattle Crisis Golf Club thread where the goal was to beat the game with the lowest score possible. Very, very cool.
But what's important that throughout the competition, people repeatedly reported they were having fun chasing those high scores at all skill levels. Even Squidlight from our own Discord server, not a big shmupper until now, worked his way up into the upper echelons of the high score list. I think this post by Mr. Sparkle sums up the sentiment pretty nicely. If the sign of a good caravan is supporting player involvement at all levels, this has been widely successful. The number of participants, spread of scores, repeat runs, improvements at all levels, it's really impressive. Before this, my go-to caravan for someone wanting to try a shmup would have been to check out an LS Soldier game. Honestly, I think Cattle Crisis might now be my go-to genre gateway suggestion for non-shmuppers. Oh man, seeing posts like this really hit home for me. It's crazy, those were exactly the problems we're struggling with, the problems we're trying to solve 2 years ago. And those are hard problems. There was no guarantee we'd be able to square this circle on top of all of the technical issues that were ahead of us. This post and other posts like this made me realize that against all odds, after all this time, somehow we hit our mark. We made an awesome shmup. Not bad. Alright, so where do we go from here? I want to spend some time promoting the game and making sure a lot of people play it. But also, this channel has been all about shmups for 2 years now, so expect the next video to be a bit of a palate cleanser. I want to do some other things for a change. Actually, probably the next video is going to be an FAQ video, so send me some questions. But also send me more suggestions on what kind of game to make next. I am keeping a tally on those. But also with Cattle Crisis, it bugs me a little bit that we haven't accomplished all that we planned for. Remember, all the way back we actually made the background for a second level, and there are actually enough sprites for 3 more boss fights. And there's actually this spectacular plot twist reveal at the end that I want to make happen. It bugs me a little bit that the current version lacks this extra content. But it also became clear to me that in order to make the game longer, I would need to make the game multicard, Pico-8 multicard, or I would need to switch to a different engine like Picotron. I still haven't quite decided which path to take here, and I'm open to suggestions in the comments. But it is clear to me I have this burning desire to make the expanded version of the game a reality somehow. But that will be a whole new story. For now, I would like to thank you for sticking with this channel for the last 2 years. It has been an incredible journey. And I couldn't have made it with all the encouragement and positive vibes I've been receiving from you guys all this time. I have been using the pronouns we in this video a lot because despite me being on the keyboard, this truly felt like a group effort to me. And of course, special shoutouts to all of the people who took more active roles in the development of the game. My warmest thanks to all of the playtesters for their tenacity and their attention to detail. Thank you Actane for your invaluable advice. Thank you Macdros for the beautiful illustrations. And thank you Sebastian for the incredible music. But perhaps most importantly, thank you to everybody who made this project possible financially. Thank you to all of my supporters on Ko-fi. So one last time in this video series, thank you to all of the new supporters, including Ollivander, Richard, Nailcall, Ragnar, Molise Elliott, Octid, Evil Paper, Deimos, Sylvain, Moloch Z, And also thank you for the generous one-time donations by Bitluder, Furiously Furious, Sprightly, and David CS. As I said, we have an FAQ coming up. Send me some questions, send me some suggestions on what kind of exciting project we should tackle next. I can't wait to discuss all of the possibilities. But also Kettle Crisis is out. Play it, get the word out, share it with your friends. I want as many people to play it as possible. Share your high score in the comments section. I've been Christian. This has been a pleasure. See you next round, guys. Bye-bye.